see their
There we
green
go.
cement mixer trucks going
All
around
right,
town.
Alan,
but they
good to
just
go.
spun
Thanks for
those
coming,
off.
Dana.
They were a unionized company competing with non-union, so they run the fleet.
Alrighty, looks like we are all set up here. Thank you very much for your patience. Charlie and I are still kind of working with this process, but we've got it going. So today we will be giving a presentation talking about the work of All Aboard Washington, which will also be featured on Zoom. We have a couple participants joining us today who will be able to see the presentation of, with our little meeting owl there and via Charlie's computer. I'm Patrick Carnahan. Along with Charlie, we are the co-executive director team of All Aboard Washington. With us today as well is our president, Kathy Davis, in the back, and our vice president, Gary Warta, here up front. So we're glad we can have you all with us today.
Patrick, you could probably take your mask off while you're speaking.
That's true. Yeah, help with broadcasting a little bit. There we go. So to start off, we want to give a generous thanks to the people who have contributed to our train trek, including the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, which is a really awesome entity out of Montana, which has started within only the past year or so and is working to advance passenger rail services in the southern tier of Montana, which could very well connect with the east-west service we're working on promoting here in central and eastern Washington. We also have a number of individuals who have kindly donated in support of the train trek, and to everyone who supports All Aboard Washington, whether as a member, a donor, a volunteer, or in leadership, we thank you for your support to make this possible. And we're really grateful that we can be here today to share our work and to learn more about what's going on here in Yakima and how we as an organization can help. So All Aboard Washington, we've been around for a while. We've been serving the state of Washington for over 40 years, championing in particular better passenger rail and freight rail services. We're a nonprofit advocacy group consisting of individuals, businesses, and other goal-oriented groups. We're working especially right now with disability rights, with environmental protection groups, people like that who have a common interest in promoting the well-being of all of Washington State. And while we've always been focused on rail, we have been working to expand our vision to be more inclusive of other modes of transportation and other concepts which are closely linked to passenger rail, and which all contribute to kind of the same transportation network. So that's something we're working on expanding. The purpose of our 2021 train track is to really get out to communities, to meet people, shake hands, share our vision for and some of the projects going on that we know will have a big impact across the entire state, but also to learn from people on the ground, what are the concerns in your communities? What are the problems you're facing? What are your priorities in Olympia? What can we do for you in Olympia? And is there anything that we're missing from our vision that we should incorporate as we do our work in Olympia? So the 2021 train trek will be bringing us all across the state. We started off on Thursday in Edmonds and Everett, made our way to Leavenworth and Wenatchee yesterday, and today we are doing a 3-event day, starting here in Yakima, going to Toppenish later on in the afternoon, and ending in Richland this evening. Continuing on from there, we'll be in Walla Walla and Lewiston tomorrow, and then we'll be going on to the Pacific Northwest Economic Region Summit in Montana, where I will be giving a presentation along with several other advocates in the region regarding passenger rail restoration efforts. That's something we're really excited and honored to be a part of at All Aboard Washington. And finally, we'll be finishing it up by continuing on through Spokane, Cheney, Ritzville, Ellensburg, and Cle Elum after Montana. So it'll be a busy day. Anything you can do to help us get some coffee for the road is greatly appreciated. So what will we be talking about specifically today? We'll start it off with connecting our organization's 3 E's, kind of our 3 guiding principles to transportation, how we think that good passenger rail service in particular, but also a lot of the things associated with it can help improve what we like to call our 3 E's, which I'll introduce a little bit later. Second, I will discuss our current efforts, and I'll mostly be focusing on the east-west passenger rail project, which I'll describe in further detail, and you can see kind of on our map there and on the table there. And finally, how you can help, how you can be involved, what you can do to contribute to advancing the 3 E's in Yakima and beyond, and particularly by working with All Aboard Washington. So let's start off with a good question, because we hear a lot of exciting discussions about things like, Hyperloop or high-speed rail or, sort of stuff like that, which is futuristic and it's cool. But we have to ask ourselves a simple question: what is world-class transportation? Maybe we think of rail, we think of the Shinkansen in Japan. We think of that new light rail system they're building in Seattle. Maybe we even think of a really good streetcar network. A lot of the times it's rail. Rail is something that gets people excited, and people think of rail as a revolutionary concept that helps with mobility, and that's kind of the definition of world-class transportation, right? Well, it's not just that. I've had the opportunity to study abroad in Japan. And even though I loved riding the bullet train there, what really made Japan amazing, what really made it a place that was super accessible, easy to get around, was the connections between not just the bullet trains, but also commuter rail, buses, bicycles, walking, elevators, escalators, all sorts of things that made it possible to get from pretty much anywhere in the country to anywhere you wanted. So when we talk about world-class transportation, it's we at All Aboard Washington are thinking about more than just trains. We're thinking about the mobility ecosystem that makes it possible to get from anywhere to anywhere fairly seamlessly. We can kind of summarize it in one simple question: is it reasonably easy to get from here to there? Do we have options? Can I do it pretty close to the time I want to do it? Can I do it in a way that I want to do it without having to bring my car along? Can I afford to do it? Kind of all those things together. Is it reasonably easy? And unfortunately, I think most of us know that most of the time it isn't, especially here in Central Washington. Charlie and I did a quick look up on Google Maps and Apple Maps just to look at some transit options across Washington. The first one we did was Seattle to Cleveland. That's not that long of a trip, right? You should just be able to hop on something that goes straight down I-90. Well, our transportation network today isn't that easy. You have to hop on a train that gets you to Wenatchee, goes across the mountains all the way over there, and then you wait overnight for a bus that goes to Ellensburg. Then you wait another hour or two for a bus that gets you to Cleveland. It takes you, it's a little hard to see on there, but right here, the travel time is 19 hours, 49 minutes, if you want to try to get around by not driving. Similarly, I did a routing on Google Maps between Spokane and Walla Walla, and it suggests literally going down into Oregon, down to Hermiston, pass by, the Tri-Cities, get onto another bus that goes to Pendleton, and then get on another bus from Pendleton to Walla Walla. So you literally have to leave the state, and it takes twice as long to get from Spokane to Walla Walla as it does by driving. And you have to leave the state and then come back in. So I think this is a reality that most of us recognize, particularly those of us who have to cross the mountains, but even within the valley, there are very limited options. The reality is, if you want to get anywhere, you either have to own a car, and in the winter you have to deal with chaining up to go across the mountains, or you have to deal with road closures for construction. And no matter what time of year, you have to deal with terrible traffic. And you have to be licensed. You have to be able to afford to drive. You have to be able to afford to own a car. You have to have the legal record and be able to get a license. And if you don't have any of that, then you're dependent on a $240 flight from Yakima to Spokane. Or you have to take a bus that may or may not exist. It might only serve less than once a day. It might only be once or twice a week. The Greyhound system, I know, has dropped off its bus network quite a bit. Doesn't that make you look forward to your next trip? We recognize at All Aboard Washington that there are a number of serious issues that are really affecting the whole state, but in particular, the Yakima Valley. East-west train service through Stampede Pass did used to exist, but it was canceled in 1981, and the route that the service that used it was rerouted over Stevens Pass. So that leaves a lot of communities here in the valley out of the transportation network. Greyhound bus service has gradually declined across the Northwest, and that makes it harder to get anywhere. SeaTac charter buses are very costly and they don't go in both directions. They only go to and from, Yakima and Seattle. They don't go east of here. Air service is very expensive, and most of the time it's not direct. Most of the time you have to connect via Seattle, which makes it more expensive and more time consuming. And then, of course, we all know about how bad the highway closures are, how bad construction is, how bad traffic is, and just how expensive in general it is to own a car. There are very few options for those who do not want to drive or who cannot drive to get around the region, let alone across the entire state. And during the pandemic, it's gotten even worse on both sides of the mountains. Amtrak Cascades during the pandemic was discontinued entirely north of Seattle, leaving a lot of communities in Northwest Washington stranded. South of Seattle, there was only one train a day running when before the pandemic, there were, I think, about 4 or 5. And then services to central and eastern Washington via the Empire Builder, one leg of which leaves from Seattle to go to Spokane via Wenatchee and Ephrata, and one leg of which leaves from Portland to Spokane via the Columbia River. Those were both cut down to 3 times a week. Who can travel on a 3-day-a-week schedule? Thankfully, ridership is recovering. Things are getting better. Several services have been restored. Trains along the existing routes are back to at least daily here in central and eastern Washington. Amtrak Cascades between Seattle and Eugene, Oregon is back to 3 times a day or 2 times a day. But there's still no service north of Seattle on Amtrak Cascades, and there's still no trains serving central and eastern Washington. But thankfully, ridership is improving. In a few days, as you can see by this graph, it actually went above the average performance from 2019. So people are wanting to travel, and particularly ridership has stayed strong in more rural parts of the state. The long distance Amtrak trains have outperformed the trains on the Northeast Corridor, which are normally the busiest ones in the Amtrak network. They've done a better job at maintaining their ridership relative to before the pandemic than the more urban trains, meaning that people who ride the trains in rural areas and particularly the long distance trains really need them a lot more than a lot of other places. So what does this all mean when it comes to transportation? What does this all mean when it comes to the work that we do at All Aboard Washington? What's the significance of passenger rail? Well, we're guided by these 3 principles for what we believe any transportation project across the state, whether on the local level or the state level or even the regional or interstate level, should do. It should focus on improving local economies, helping with economic development, whether that's through tourism, through land development, through improving the lives of people and opening up more economic opportunities for people. It should be about the environment. It should be about making sure that we can provide transportation services to people who need them at a reduced cost to the environment. We should be good stewards of the environment and make the best use of environmentally friendly alternatives that we do have. And equity. It shouldn't just be about providing services in Seattle. It should be about connecting the entire region. It should be about making it easy to go from wherever you want to go to wherever you want to go. It should be easier to access family, medical care, recreational opportunities, whatever it might be that you want. You should have access to that regardless of whether you're in a small town, a rural community, or a big city. And we know that trains contribute to all 3 of these. With regards to economy, we know that good transportation services make it easier for people to travel to do what they want and need to do. Based on data from Amtrak, we understand that about 11% of train riders in Washington state, that includes the Amtrak Cascades corridor as well as the Empire Builder routes, about 11% of train riders in Washington would not have chosen to travel had they not had access to the train, whether it's because their community lacks transportation services, whether because the options they have would have been more expensive or more inconvenient. The train makes it easier for people to get where they want and need to go. And so that makes a big impact on local economies. We understand from Experience Washington, our state's tourism bureau, that the average day trip visitor spends $84 in the communities that they visit, or $366 if they spend the night. And that adds up to a huge impact here in particularly in central and eastern Washington. Over $7 million of tourist spending would be generated based on the information we have of ridership estimates from the east-west service that our organization is promoting. And a lot of that would be here in the valley. Equity and accessibility. It's easy for people in Seattle to forget that some people live outside of Seattle. And we know that we are a diverse state that has people living in all corners, in all regions, on both sides of the mountains. And for those who live outside of Seattle, for those who live outside of the Puget Sound, we know that the way our state government is working right now, the way that our transportation services work, it's really hard to get anywhere without a car. You know, if you don't own a car, if you can't afford it, if you are not able to get a license, if you can't get insurance, then you're stuck where you're at. And we understand in particular, and the Yakima Valley has some of the highest rates, or some of the lowest rates of car ownership in the entire state. That despite the lack of options for getting around. We know that urban communities are not the only ones who benefit from better transit access, and we understand that a key way of improving equity across the entire state is to better connect the state with services that join everyone. We believe that passenger rail can contribute to that by working as sort of a backbone, a spine, if you will, that connects a lot of the existing local transportation services together than any of the other modes that exist. We know that Wenatchee, for example, has a great bus system locally, but that it's really hard to get out of Wenatchee by the bus. There aren't a whole lot of options for getting there. Having the Empire Builder there as it exists right now makes it possible for people to get anywhere that they want and have local transit connections at either end. So it works as sort of a corridor that connects the local transit services that exist. And we know the same would be true here in the Yakima Valley. If you have access to the bus right now, but you can't, leave or you can't get here, then it makes it hard to go. So having that option in the middle that connects everything together is really a critically important way of improving mobility. So we believe that improving local public transit connections to intercity rail services will improve mobility and accessibility for people. We also understand that the way that the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Federal Railroad Administration weigh equity when it comes to grant applications is not very good. They focus a lot on travel time saved. So that's why highway projects get advanced a lot, because there are formulas out there that say that by adding a lane, that somehow equals travel time saved, even though we know that when you build another lane of freeways, it gets just as congested, or maybe it doesn't do anything at all to help. But we understand that at the federal level, there's a lot of work to advance equity as a key measure for a project's success and a project's value. So that's something we're pushing for at All Aboard Washington. And finally, the environment. We understand with the data that we have less than 10 years to cut emissions by 45% of 2010 levels in order to avert serious climate damage. And meanwhile, at the state level, there's a lot of talk about high-speed rail, which would take 20, maybe 30 years to build, and it would only serve the I-5 corridor. Do we have time to keep kicking the can as usual? I don't think so. We have to be looking at better options. And we understand, based on data from the EPA, that 29% of the US's emissions, the largest category of the large share of our emissions, comes from transportation. And of that, 82% is from road vehicles, which includes heavy trucks like semis, as well as passenger vehicles. So what we really need to be focused on are, in the short term, the action we need to be taking is to divert as much traffic as possible, to provide options that allow people to get out of their cars, that allow people particularly to get on rails. And the fastest way that we can do that at this point is by working with the infrastructure we have, using our existing rails and providing services that enable people and freight to get where they need to go by rail, rather than depending on roads and air only. So I guess if we could summarize our vision in one paragraph or one sentence, we believe at All Aboard Washington that with some prudent short-term investments, particularly in rail, we believe Washington State can revive the rail revolution it started in the 1990s when it first envisioned high-speed rail and envisioned a statewide passenger rail network. We can get back on track toward creating a truly world-class transportation network, not just a rail network, but a transit network for all. This is a more detailed kind of version of our vision has been published in the American Public Transportation Association's newsletter called Speedlines, which is something I wrote back in May and was published back in May. But we can kind of summarize it with this map right here. This is kind of where we're starting. This isn't a list of all of the ideas that we have for how we could improve transportation across the state and how we could better connect the state. But this is what we believe is a short-term actionable vision of sort of backbone services that we can promote that would help better connect all corners of the state and make sure that there's equitable transportation access for all. The big part we'll be focusing on today is this green line here between Seattle and Spokane via the Yakima Valley, which is a service that's been studied for a while called East-West Passenger Rail Service. So our vision includes Amtrak Cascades improving service in that corridor because we understand that there's a lot of demand and a lot of interest in trains there, and the better connections to local transit, the addition of more stations. But like I said, what we'll really be focusing on today is east-west trains across Stampede Pass. This map right here details the project more specifically as it's envisioned by the state at the moment. We as advocates would like to push for more stations in places like Prosser, Cheney, Connell, and Ritzville. But as the project is being studied right now by the state, this is what it looks like. It starts in Seattle, goes down to Auburn, and then from Auburn, it joins the Stampede Pass line and would cross through Cle Elum, Ellensburg, Yakima, Toppenish, and the Tri-Cities before then heading up to Spokane along some tracks that currently serve Amtrak trains between Spokane and Portland. And it's been around for a little while. The idea has been formally studied since at least the late 1990s and early 2000s. And there have been a number of studies that have come about since then, but just for under a variety of circumstances, it's taken a while to come to reality. The first study was published in June of 2001 by WashDOT and HDR, and it was just a basic analysis of the service. Answer the question, is east-west passenger rail service via Stampede Pass feasible? And it answered that it is in fact feasibly, physically and operationally feasible. The tracks are there. There are no serious obstacles toward restarting service except for certain infrastructure improvements. And based on the use of the line by the freight railroad that owns it, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, it is something that's usable as a route. But unfortunately, due to some circumstances that were happening at the time, there was serious funding cuts that happened right after the study was published. And so unfortunately, WashDOT didn't really take up further study of the route beyond that point, while there were other issues that were trying to be sorted out with transportation. This was mostly related to a cut in car tax fees at the time. So we at All Aboard Washington, knowing that a lot of time had passed and that things were starting to get better in the past decade, pushed for a ridership assessment study by Central Washington University in Ellensburg. We sponsored the study, and it was conducted by Professor John Bowen and some of his students in the geography department at Central Washington University. And we basically just wanted to ask a question: is there interest in east-west passenger rail? And if so, what does that interest look like? Where would people want to go? How much do people really want this? And we found that there was, in fact, considerable interest in and really a pretty serious expression of the need for cross-state passenger service through South Central Washington, serving communities in the Kittitas and Yakima valleys and connecting them to Spokane and Seattle and beyond. And over the past couple of years, we worked with the legislature to convince them to fund the next level of study that was necessary in order for the project to advance, and we were successful with that in 2019. So in 2020, the state's Joint Transportation Commission published the next level feasibility study, which answered some more detailed questions, such as what's the ridership going to look like? What are the specific infrastructure improvements that are needed in order to make this service work? How would the coordination work with the freight railroads? Things like that, that would help decision makers move on to some of the further steps to continue realizing east-west passenger rail. Once again, they found no serious issues with the service being feasible. And in fact, they found also formally through their own processes that there was a huge level of community support. They found that 77% of their participants were either partially or strongly in favor of the project, and that it could generate ridership that's very comparable to other Amtrak state corridors, such as the Piedmont in North Carolina. The ridership suggested here by just 2 trains a day between Seattle and Spokane would be comparable to that of a service that offers 3 or 4 trains a day in a much more urbanized corridor in North Carolina. And we found that the cost of this, despite the fact that it's a statewide corridor crossing all the way from Seattle to Spokane and through the Yakima Valley and into the Tri-Cities, it would cost less than $500 million in order to make it a reality. And that's comparable, if not, significantly less than some of the projects of widening I-90 for 6 miles. But as usual with a lot of projects like this, there was a little bit of pushback from the agencies because a lot of consultancy agencies focus on highway projects and the criteria that they use with regards to examining travel time saved and not pushing so much for equity. They had some pushback. They thought that it was sufficient to only consider people who would be driving. Meanwhile, Amtrak's own data suggests that over half of people who ride the Amtrak train don't drive. They would either choose not to travel, they would choose to take a bus if it was available, or they would choose to take a plane. So we believe that there's a significant underestimation of the potential ridership for the service, this despite the fact that it's just as good as, if not better than, some other state-supported corridors across the country. And we also know that 20% of Washingtonians don't have a driver's license. So you're missing out on a huge population of people who would be choosing to travel or who would want to travel right there. We also understand that they push down ridership estimates, or they've made some negative comments about the service being slow. And end to end, the service would be slow due to the mountainous terrain, mostly between Auburn and Cle Elum. But that could be expected, right? Going through the mountain pass, of course, the service is going to be a little slower end to end. And the purpose of the service is not to be the fastest way to get from Seattle to Spokane. The purpose of this service is to provide significantly better connections to people living in the middle. It's really people in the Yakima and Kittitas valleys who would benefit from this service by having connections not only within the valley, but also to either of the endpoints, wherever they would want to travel within the state. Even if it's not the fastest way to get there, it would at least be a much better option than many of the existing ones. Plus, travel times within the valley between Cle Elum and the Tri-Cities and between the Tri-Cities and Spokane are fairly competitive with driving and other modes. So we believe that that's a significant point to consider. There were also some discussions on costs being a little bit higher than what we think would be necessary. For example, we understand that there's a train station here in Yakima that could probably be used. They also assume that they would need to build new stations in Ellensburg and Toppenish, which we know there are train stations there, could also be used, either privately owned or are in the process of transferring to public ownership, where that shouldn't be necessary to build a completely new station, perhaps just updating the platforms for ADA compliance. Like I mentioned, the car-derived ridership is something that the STEER study pushed quite a bit, but this doesn't reflect Amtrak's own data. About 47% of people who would be riding the train would drive otherwise if they didn't have the train available. That's only half of the ridership. So we believe that STEER may have underestimated the ridership by as much as half, basically because they only considered potential riders from cars, even though Amtrak's own data, which includes services in rural and urban areas in Washington, suggests that there's a significantly higher amount of partnership. Oh, and by the way, considering that 32% of people who would fly, knowing how expensive flights are here in Yakima, and considering the project that the state is embarking on to build potentially a second SeaTac airport, we think that by better providing connections with rail, even if it's not necessarily as fast here in the valley, would probably help reduce some of the need for that extra expenditure. And that's something that wasn't particularly considered. But what we do know about East-West Rail is that public support is exceptionally strong. According to several quotes from the study, And as mentioned earlier, over 70% of participants agree that they would try the service and are highly supportive of the service. We found support among stakeholders across the region, and in particularly in the cities of Yakima and Pasco, the Yakima Nation, and even senior representatives of the freight railroad that owns the tracks. And less than 5% of people were opposed to the project in any form, which is one of the smallest rates of opposition to a project that the consulting firm said they'd ever seen. Even popular projects a lot of times tend to have a larger point of opposition on things of cost, but not here. People absolutely recognize the needs and they really want it. And Steer's recommendation was that further work be done to confirm their findings, to refine them, and to come up with some of the information that would be needed for grant applications, including an economic analysis and a cost benefit analysis. So that's the east-west service. And that's one part of several major needs that we as an organization are working to try to address here in Washington. Our 5 major needs that we're working on are restoring services where existing services are or have been. We want them to come back. Number 2, increasing frequencies. Frequency is a huge part of making a train useful for people because the more often it departs, the more trips you have within a day, the easier it is to use the train without having to plan your life around a schedule. And that's true in urban and rural corridors. Number 3 is acquiring equipment. We understand that there's a significant need for new equipment here. Oh, I think that's right, I have these. Let me work with these really quick. Yeah, so when we're talking about restoring service here, we're talking about it at the very minimum, restoring the service that was lost as a result of the pandemic to Northwest Washington, which is the Cascades train that goes between Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia. We understand that that's going to be reopening possibly later on in the year, but that's going to depend on negotiations with the Canadian government on the border situation, which is unfortunately a very complicated process. We tried to push to have the train continue on to Bellingham and then just stop there temporarily while we're waiting for the border to reopen. But that's unfortunately a challenging issue. It doesn't seem like there's any parking available there now like there was in the past. Increasing Cascades frequencies and looking at how we can do the same with other trains. My colleague and fellow board member, Abe Zumwalt, found that when you increase the frequency on a train, you significantly increase its utility. And once you get about 6 to 8 trips on a train, people no longer have to look at the schedule as carefully, and they can just go to the train station, or they can just say, okay, I know that there's going to be a train before too long, and they can choose to use the train and it will work with their schedule. Pushing to try to improve frequencies on the Amtrak Cascade service on the west side of the mountains, as well as to push for studies of higher frequencies with the east-west line, we believe would significantly improve the utility of the service, make it an easier service for people all across the state to use. Now, for both of these, this is a serious challenge as well, acquiring new equipment. One thing that is not talked about a whole lot is that it's very difficult and time-consuming to produce new passenger train equipment. Most of our equipment that owned by Amtrak is approaching 30 to 40 years old. And there's a contract out right now for Amtrak to produce new trains, starting with a lot of the intercity trains in the Midwest and then expanding to some of the long distance and other state-supported routes across the country. But it takes time. Based on the information we have, most of these new train sets are not going to be in service until at least 4 to 5 years from now, and possibly longer. So while we're waiting for new equipment, we need to be, planning out services that we need, and then also continuing the process of planning how do we get new equipment and how do we keep it in good shape over the long run. Then number 4, addressing this network problem that we have. We know that there's a serious talk about high-speed rail in Olympia, but the project as it's envisioned right now, unlike what is displayed on this map, would only serve the I-5 corridor. There is no talk of trying to improve transportation equity in central and eastern Washington. And we know that, as much as we would love to see high-speed rail as a concept, much as I love the bullet train being in Japan, we know that we need to be focusing on improving things in the short term. We need to be focusing on equity in central and eastern Washington. We can't forget the eastern 2/3 of our state, and or else not even high-speed rail is going to win at the ballot box, let alone contribute to our state's goals of improving equity and mobility for all people. So we believe that we need to start by building a good grid, a network that serves the entire state, whether by trains or by buses, pedestrian improvements, because that's the only way that we're really going to be able to advance, higher caliber projects like high-speed rail and create a transportation system that's equitable for all. What we do believe, though, is at least in the short term that there are some good next steps for east-west passenger rail. Particularly, we need to obtain a benefit cost analysis, which would be conducted by the state, and that would analyze the service's impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, safety benefits, helping reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled within the state, and improving equity in urban and rural areas across the entire state. And economic analysis. This would analyze what the service does for local businesses, what it does for local wine growers, what it does for the hospitality industry, what it does for tax revenues, what it does for jobs, quality of life, property values, all of this. And with these two analyses, that would help make the east-west service eligible for federal grants. That would be definitely helpful in making the service a reality. And finally, improving feedback channels. People across the entire state of Washington, if they go into their local county auditor's office and pay to renew their vehicle tabs, they pay an $8 fee, right, Gary?
$8.
They pay an $8 fee that goes to support the ferries. We all know that we don't have ferries in central and eastern Washington. Why don't we have an option for rail? Why don't we have better connections to rail? And we don't have a feedback mechanism for rail. The ferry riders have a lot of political power thanks to the existence of their FROG, Ferry Riders Opinion Group, which consults with the Washington State Transportation Commission and gives feedback on ideas that they want. We believe that if we're going to improve equity for rail and intercity bus passengers across the state, we need to have a passenger rail opinion group, a PROG. I know a frog makes a ribbit sound. I don't know what a PROG makes, but we think we should have a PROG anyways. We think that that would be a big thing toward improving the quality of the experience for passenger rail riders. So what are we asking for specifically in Olympia? We're asking to take the next steps on the east-west trains, the benefit cost analysis and the economic impact analysis. We're asking to restore and expand Amtrak Cascade services, which is a big part of helping people across the state see just how good passenger trains can be and why they're a helpful addition to our transportation network, and creating that passenger rail opinion group with the Transportation Commission. So that way passenger rail riders have an outlet to give their feedback and ideally improve the services. Now, what can you do to help with this? How can you contribute to our mission at All Aboard Washington and toward improving passenger rail and intercity bus services across the state? The first thing is awareness. Despite the interest in the service among those who know about east-west passenger rail service, the biggest challenge that we have encountered as advocates is the lack of awareness. There aren't a lot of people talking about it. And we're doing the best we can to spread the word, let people know that the project exists, and have discussions on what we can do to make it a reality. So the first thing that you can do is to let your friends and family and anybody you know who's ever talked about how frustrating it is, dealing with the options we have right now or the lack thereof, that we have an option, that we have a potential project that would help the entire region. So let everybody know that you talk with, everybody that you know that passenger rail is a thing, east-west passenger rail. And the second is, in particular, to talk with your representatives, whether that's at the city level, your mayor, your city council, whether that's a regional organization like your metropolitan planning organization or the Yakima County Development Organization, whether that's your state legislators, your representatives or your senators in Olympia, or your representatives in Congress. We need to let everybody know about the service, and everybody needs to know that you support the service. When your representatives hear from you, when they hear your ideas and they hear just how much you want to see it happen, things happen. Representatives are much more likely to take action on a project when they know that it's there and they know that they have your support as constituents. And there's a few talking points that we have, kind of a few different ways that you can kind of talk about it, because people get caught up in, oh, well, why does the state have to, pay a little bit of extra tax money in order to run the service? Shouldn't the service pay for itself? Oh, why don't we just keep expanding highways? Because all we got to do is fix traffic congestion. The way that we like to frame it at All Aboard Washington, and we think that is really effective, is that we need to get our transportation priorities straight. It can't just be about doing the same things that we've done over and over, because that hasn't helped with equity, that hasn't helped with economic development, and that hasn't helped with the environment. We need to get our priorities straight and focus on projects that address all three of these issues, and particularly projects that improve accessibility and the interconnectivity of our transportation system, because without that, our transportation system is not working equitably for all. We need to have prudent short-term action. It's great to have plans. It's great to be, looking in the long term at what the possibilities are, but there's also a need for short-term action. We can't keep dragging our feet and not doing things. We need to have some good short-term action items that are actionable, that are realistic, and that help. And finally, that better east-west passenger trains and Amtrak Cascades trains benefit the entire region. They create a grid that makes it possible to get from anywhere to anywhere in combination with all of the other local transportation modes that we have. And finally, stronger grassroots advocacy. This has been a challenge for rail advocacy for a long time, but it's something that we're really working hard on here at All Aboard Washington, and that we're doing the best we can in order to make your voice heard across the entire state, and to make sure that your representatives in Olympia know what your priorities and wants are. So there are three things that you can do in cooperation with All Aboard Washington to help us get your voice to the representatives who make decisions on your behalf. The first is volunteering. We need a lot of help. We've been doing a lot more than ever before. There's a lot more interest and energy around passenger rail and infrastructure than there has been at any point in history, pretty much. And in order to keep people informed and to make sure we're keeping up with what's going on, we need help with community outreach. We need help with event planning, like the train trek event that we're hosting right now. We do a lot of writing, both on social media and our newsletter, and we have a quarterly newsletter that comes out that we need help editing. Any of these ways that you can contribute as a volunteer help contribute to our cause and help advance our cause. And additionally, with regard to leadership, leadership is a critically important thing in our organization. There's a lot going on, and as a director, as a member of our board, or as an executive, you make the difference in terms of setting the direction of our organization and making it possible. Whether that's with helping us with fundraising, developing our organizational policy, working with our government affairs director in Olympia to help maintain the connections we have in Olympia and beyond, and with networking, introducing us to your communities, introducing us to your leaders, and spreading the word on our organization and our mission. And finally, with donations. There's a lot that goes on and a lot of expenses that go on to help us continue the work that we do. And our goal is to raise $7,000 for the organization by the end of the train track on August 21st. And we've made good progress, but we still have a long ways to go. In any way that you can help whatsoever, whether that's through your own personal donations or whether that's letting other people know about our organization, or connecting us with grant opportunities, any of these things that you can do to help our organization keep up the work that it does makes a huge difference. And we're really grateful for your support of our organization and our mission. So that leads us on to our discussion. We want to hear from you. That's exactly why we're here. We know that what we've talked about today are a lot of things that are kind of in the pipeline. They're things that are being worked on. And they're things that we as an organization, believe are realistic, short-term steps that we can take to improve transportation across the entire state, and particularly here in the Yakima Valley. But we want to hear from you about what you believe your biggest challenges here in Yakima are. What are your top priorities? What are the things that matter to you when it comes to how we can improve transportation, whether just in the valley or across the entire state? And is there something that you see that's missing, something that you think that we can include, whether in our short-term vision like we have presented here, or maybe our organization's long-term vision? Is there something that we can add that would help you? So I'll open it up from here. And we can just have a discussion. I'll grab a pen and paper because I want to make sure we get everybody's ideas.
So the question really is, how do we get these people involved? How do we get the city of Yakima involved, maybe the county commissioners involved, interested in this? Or is anybody interested? I mean, it amazes me that this room isn't full. And that's just a symbol of the challenge that we have to get people interested enough to make this project happen. And unless we make some noise to our elected representatives, whether that's local or state, we're not going to get anywhere with this. Because it's kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, if you will, when it comes to Olympia funding anything. Everybody we talk to is interested in the project. It's just difficult to get people involved enough to do something, like write to their representatives.
Yeah, I would agree. Getting the city and the county involved would be critical. Why? Because those buildings, I mean, our train station is notoriously known for being an old historical building that can't be updated. So we would need to build another train station to meet the current needs of the travelers, which means handicap accessibility and access and parking. A lot of what, looking here, if we're going to actually talk about the benefit to the businesses, really have to look at the infrastructure first. I do transportation studies for my business, Capital Analytical here in Yakima, in line with a group called Front and Center, which is a state advocating organization. They're doing huge transportation across the state and federally to understand, the infrastructure issues. So in Yakima, our buses aren't handicapped. Our bus stops are not handicap approved. So they also have, very large frequencies. Some of the stops have been moved to less convenient places. So it has a history of not actually updating it for use as opposed to cost. And in talking with the city and trying to work towards the future on these infrastructure issues that are not supported by the money they get, they immediately talk about having to apply for grants, federal programs. So they need assistance with that. Now, I don't know if that's something your organization or your organization in lieu with other coalition organizations that you do this work with. I noticed that a lot of your sponsors are individuals as opposed to like organizations. I'm part of the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition here in Yakima. We look at civic and social justice issues. So transportation basically is a dignity equity issue. So like you said, 20% don't have cars. Yakima, I actually can't get to the unemployment facility from my house
Without a car.
Yeah. So if you actually start Googling it and just go block by block by block, you'll find large swaths. And that was part of the city and the county's process. They just moved that facility out of downtown Yakima. You do have a downtown bus terminal, but it doesn't really serve like what you consider the business population area, because that's all demographically changed. So a lot of what you're talking about is restructuring with the train, the transportation, and a lot of the other central infrastructure systems in Yakima. So that's something that your organization and your coalition really needs to plant the seeds with the city government. They're slow to act, they're slow to respond. They're all about making money for their businesses. If you can get the Downtown Business Association in on it, they would probably, they're the ones that control most of the businesses around that area. They would see the benefit of this improved, what I would say, additional tourist network, as opposed to like an infrastructure where people aren't necessarily using for work or jobs. They use it to visit their friends, their families, extracurricular. And it will begin with the most wealthy and retired people using it. And that's, I I've lived in Yakima almost all my life, traveled around the Western Hemisphere, only to come back to Yakima and see these deficiencies.
Mhm.
So definitely planting the seed with the city and the county as early as possible. Really talking about this growth, but basically on the backside, you have to make sure transportation, the infrastructure is a primary focus, because if they're not willing to develop a specific area for this, then you're not going to see the usage or the statistics from the usage that you're anticipating. That's pretty much been the history of the way that things have been in Yakima. They tried to do a downtown center park, and they talked about all this growth, but they didn't talk about the in-betweens enough to allow the people to understand how these expenses can actually be paid for. And obviously how business.
Excuse me, that's those are all very, very good points. We do work with Front and Center. We work with Disability Rights Washington, which is, those are organizations that, as some people want to call it, the last mile issues. How do you get out of your front door to where you need to go within your town? And then where do you go from there? And yes, that's obviously something that our organization can only do so much with the limited resources that we have. But we would absolutely be interested in working with you and the organizations that you're part of to, bring these issues to the fore. I think we're aware that a lot of people don't even think about passenger trains, certainly in the Yakima Valley, because they haven't seen one in many years. Yet it would actually fill an important gap in the transportation options that people need. When we're in Big Sky next week, we will be working on a panel with Anna Zevarts from Disability Rights Washington and Martin Charlo from the Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. And we'll be talking about how we connect all of those sorts of organizations. But that obviously we need your help on the local level to make that work, to connect with these people. It's one of the advantages I think we have now after the pandemic is that it's much easier to communicate remotely than it used to be. And so we would be more than happy to have presentations with organizations and then feedback from organizations. I mean, we're doing this in person, which is great, but we know that there's only so much of that can be done. But if you've got an organization that is having a meeting where we could participate, we'd love to do that.
Just
go ahead.
Recently, we had a meeting with the Yakima County Development Association. We invited the Chamber, Verlin Best, to this meeting today, and she said she was going to be here. But both of those groups, we get almost no reaction from either one of them. Now, over a year ago, I wrote a proposed letter of resolution to the city council for the mayor. This is just before the pandemic, asking them to sign a resolution in support of passenger rail service because they signed one before several years ago.
Yeah.
So I said, well, it's time for a new one. Well, then the pandemic set in and that thing's been tabled. It's just been very, very frustrating to get anyone around this town interested enough to basically move this project off from square one.
Yeah, and I do know the workforce development program was their new report, updated report. I know King County released theirs. So I called Yakima and asked them, are you guys going to release yours on time? And they said no, because of COVID, all of that workforce development process is almost 2 years behind schedule. So this would also be something in line with that I know that a lot of Yakima just been sitting on their hands because of COVID. Their employees just haven't come to work. Are irresponsible. I've had issues with city services because because of it. But knowing that, we do have an office in the chamber building. I can ask her that when she's not here. But those are the hidden pressures that Yakima break. When you're part of these projects, people know who you are. And I do feel that trains are important. I actually rode the train when I was a kid out of Yakima to go to Auburn. That was something we did quite regularly. Why? Because it was convenient. The time in the morning didn't matter. It was just, not having to get on the roads in the middle of winter. And those are the kind of benefits that a lot of people can take advantage of if we can get over the hiccups of getting the local workforce development council and some of the Yakima entities to start the actual infrastructure process.
We have been quite successful working with the Yakima Valley Council of Governments.
Yeah.
I attend their monthly technical advisory committee meetings.
Okay. Great.
Alan Adolph knows me. So, and they were very supportive. Jim Rastucci, who's the COG policy board director, signed a letter out to Maria Cantwell, for example, supporting some of the language that's now in the rail infrastructure bill that was just passed by the Senate. So we have had some progress, but there needs to be, like Patrick says, there needs to be more grassroots kinds of things that come from the local citizens to their elected officials and say, hey, come on, can't you support this? The ferry lobby has been very successful at lobbying for new ferries. There's millions in the budget right now to electrify all the ferries. And there's, the state over the last 3 or 4 years has been purchasing these Olympic class ferries that are 165 million each. Well, come on, can't we do something for the rest of the state?
Yeah, I was actually on a meeting just a couple days ago that talked about the disproportionate expense of the ferry system, along with the ecological environmental impact. It's not being accounted for. It is one of the biggest issues for state transportation. So I completely agree. It's a good conversation. I'll definitely give you my card.
Yeah, I've got one here too. I'll give you.
Yeah, I'd love to get because I'm also working on the bus, specifically the bus system. That's one of the things that I've been working on over the last year, because I am considered handicapped. I know there's local SNAP groups that can't get to their groceries and back without the milk or cheese starting to get too hot, especially with the way we've had all this horrible weather.
Yeah.
But to understand the transportation deficiencies in the bus system could go hand in hand with the infrastructure development to actually say, let's actually just change the way the buses work, let's move some of the hubs, let's actually utilize all potentials of the train so that we can create an actual tourist network. So those are the bigger picture things that I see in this project could not only help
Absolutely.
transportation, but also reinforce the idea that this is a workable project. And that's where if you can line them up, that's where the state grants and applications, if they can't find people to write the state grants, that's the city and the county issues that the local groups can basically say, no, we have this project, you need to come to the table with the right resources that you notoriously have not in the past. So that's kind of my angle, is to forcibly make the city and the county apply for the grants that they historically have not been applying for, that I'm learning from the state level are wide open, and that the state officials are saying, why hasn't Yakima actually done this? Well, then you look, and they're just not willing to do the actual full work. So the right seeds in the right places.
And in
Yeah.
the Senate infrastructure bill that they just passed, there's millions in there for various kinds of grant programs to support exactly this kind of project. Now, but there are a lot of different plans and things that have to be done. Some of it requires state money. For example, the cost benefit analysis that Pat mentioned and the economic analysis both need to be funded by the state before you can apply for these federal grants. But that's not a huge sum. The big money is in the grants. Some of these are 50% or more in grants. So we've got to start laying the groundwork to get this cost benefit analysis done and the economic analysis. But that takes action by the legislature to ask WashDOT to do that. WashDOT is not going to do it on their own. They need the funds to do it, and that has to be appropriated by the legislature.
And what we found is that the way that our Amtrak Cascades rail system is kind of structured right now makes it very difficult to do that. Before about the year 2000, WashDOT had a specific independent rail office, and that was who our previous executive director, Lloyd Flem, who's been around with the organization for a very long time. He worked with them in the 1990s, and it was thanks to a lot of leadership within the rail office, as well as political leadership, that helped advance the Amtrak Cascades program and made that happen. But then around the year 2000, there were a few changes that happened. One of which was that the Transportation Commission lost a lot of its authority over WashDOT and became more of an advisory group. Even though it still has some influence, it became advisory more than kind of policy based, or being able to instruct WashDOT to do as much. And I think at about the same time, the rail office was consolidated into what is now the Rail, Freight, and Ports Division. And so now the same people who should be working on rail are also having, passenger rail, like Amtrak Cascades, like the East-West project, now have to also deal with the freight railroads, the trucking lobby, the ports. So they have, in their view, they have bigger fish to fry. And so passenger rail kind of falls off the plate as a priority for them. So that presents a challenge when it comes to leadership within WashDOT pushing for the projects, but that means that it's really down to the legislature, as like Gary said, to provide the funding and instruct WashDOT on what they do, what the priorities are.
The national organization that we work with, the Rail Passengers Association, has a really good presentation called Trains Make Money. And the idea is that it does in fact make financial sense for the local communities that trains serve, because they get more in return from having train service than it costs. And so, a lot of times you hear, well, Amtrak loses money. Well, Amtrak is not the important part. It's what the neighborhoods that it serves get. And we've got all sorts of stories. One of the famous ones, our friend John Robert Smith from Meridian, Mississippi, which is where Patrick is from, was the mayor at the time that they put in some minor amount of money to build an intermodal transit center. And they've got numbers to show that the return on that investment has been tremendous. And even here in Washington State, look up the road at Leavenworth, okay? Rob Eaton, who was the mayor then, convinced Amtrak to create a stop there. And that has been a huge boon for their tourism industry, which is why later on in this train track, we're going to be in Walla Walla, and the Walla Walla wine people are going to be there, because they absolutely want to see this happen, because they recognize the importance of having rail to come to their town so that people can come and have some wine. And that could be done here. And Gary was telling us last night about all the hop growers. Those are the people that would benefit tremendously from having people come into town.
The wineries around town here, and some of the fruit growers.
Or at least those are the people influenced that would.
Yes, yes.
As we're discovering with our advocacy, there's this very, difficult and fine balance, between trying to find, make sure that our projects are rooted in our three principles, and particularly in equity, while also figuring out how do we make connections with, a lot of the interests that help, the financial interests that help make it happen. It's a very, delicate balancing act. We think that, if we do it right, and if we make sure that we, factor in improvements to the transit network, the local transit network, how do we make this work for, improving mobility across the entire region? and what does this do for the bottom lines of the businesses in the area who would benefit from the service? If we can combine those together, we know that that helps make the project happen, and then everybody benefits from that.
And, we're calling it seamless, seamless transportation. Again, being able to go out your front door and get to where you need to go, whether it be the unemployment office, whether it be, the grocery store, or whether it be Seattle.
Hill to get some medical attention.
Yeah,
I mean, one of the two major hospitals here in town closed last year. Now, if you need a heart surgery, you have to go to Seattle. Well, some people can't drive. They don't want to drive, and let's face it, Yakima, I think, really has poor transportation services. You got 2 flights to Seattle, and you've got one bus a day to Seattle now, and Greyhound could go under. There's no insurance that's going to continue in the future. I think there'd be a huge ridership from Yakima to Seattle.
so we would be very interested in working with the groups that you work with. The Disability Rights Washington people are busily collecting stories of, the issues that people have getting from point A to point B.
And I can find their vision map. They have a great map that they've worked on.
Yeah, and it is, we're working with them and with the Sierra Club of Washington and a number of other groups, including Front and Center, you mentioned them earlier, that really we all need to be working together on this. One of the things that people may not be aware of is that tires cause immense pollution that is killing salmon. And, this is the Northwest. People are concerned about that. And so trains are almost the only transportation mode that doesn't use rubber tires.
Find the article.
Yeah, we had testimony with that group for Washington Transportation Commission about access. That was basically the Eastern Washington, where most people were from Seattle and Tacoma. About, like you said, just that last 50 feet of sidewalk that's missing. Maybe get to my bus stop without crossing private property or walking on the street. So,
Right.
Yeah, we totally understand that it's connected, and I think that's a challenge that we at All Aboard Washington are working hard to try to address, is that rail advocacy for so long has focused only on the trains, and kind of with the work that Charlie and I and Gary and other people have been doing with the organization over the past while, we've seen how with different transportation advocacy groups, people get into this kind of silo mind of, oh, I just want this, oh, I just want that, and what we really need to be doing is figuring out how to work together. How do we improve not just the passenger rail system, but local transit, also cycling lanes, also sidewalks?
I mean, from my point of view, is, I'm a young person, and a lot of us find it's on our mind a lot. You go outside, you have to smoke, it's just kind of like the slap in the face, and oh, we're the ones that, get to live in the end.
Yeah.
But for me, like, I see, so like between cost of car insurance, it's like $3,000 a year aggressive tax. Because I moved to Yakima, I was like, oh, yes, I should be able to get to work and back on the public transport, and it's not feasible, especially because places that I wouldn't necessarily want to be biking at night. And some of my shifts go later than the bus. And I know that when I'm thinking about where I want to move, where I want to live, that being able to live somewhere without a car rates pretty high on my priorities. That is that's one thing that would stop me from living back long term and from wanting to live in work. It's the fact that I have to own a car. another reason why I want to see the Yakima to prosper is, young to prosper.
As a footnote, one of the interesting things is the steer study that Patrick talked about. They did a calculation that one of the most large areas where they would get ridership was in the Yakima Valley. Not so much between Seattle and Spokane, but people who wanted to go from Yakima to Toppenish to the Tri-Cities. Because as you said, there's not a whole lot of other options there.
Well, one of the reasons the steer study says there's a high ridership, there's 116,000 annual riders they estimated between here and Toppenish, out of 206,000 annual. So basically, they're saying like half of the ridership would be between here and Toppenish. But the reason they say that is based on speed. The track speed between here and Toppenish is 59 miles an hour, and they say the highway speed is very similar. Therefore, a lot of people would take the train. And that goes back to this travel time save issue. There's this continual effort on these transportation projects about travel time save. If you can save 5 minutes, that's worth some money. And your project is going to rate higher by the U.S. Department of Transportation because it saves 5 minutes than one that doesn't. So that's why they said the ridership would be high between Yakima and Toppenish. We're saying there's a lot of other reasons you would get on a train other than just to beat the speed of driving a car. I mean, some of these cities have no service at all, you know, and they would ride the train.
And this is something that a person that Charlie and I spoke with on the phone, this gentleman who lives in Japan and has a lot of interest in rail. And we talked a little while on the phone about some potential ideas for additional things we could do beyond just the Seattle to Spokane east-west project. This isn't something that's on the books at WashDOT. This isn't something that is, you know, an existing project in any kind of formal way. But just as an example of how maybe this is something that we could incorporate into our vision, or this is something that we can start to have more conversations about with our local officials. And that might be a great addition to the project that we're talking about. This guy, his name is Charles Bookman, he suggested that given a lot of the ridership potential that was displayed, you know, given the competitive travel times within the Yakima Valley, that maybe something of a local service, sort of like a commuter or regional train could be created that would serve the corridor between Cle Elum and the Tri-Cities. That runs multiple times a day, where there's a little bit more capacity, where the track speed's a little bit faster, and where there's a fairly significant demand for regional transportation. And this isn't something that would compete with Amtrak Cascades or an east-west service that would serve this corridor. Ideally, if you did it the right way, you could get them to complement each other, where you have a local service using the existing rails, the local service and the regional train, the long distance train going from Seattle to Spokane and through the middle, and the local train together combine some of their resources. They both invest in a lot of the same rails, and they both take advantage of it where they can. Then you have multiple daily trains in the entire region, you know, going between Cle Elum and the Tri-Cities, and in combination with some of the longer distance trains that go there. Like I said, this isn't an existing project on the books, but it's a concept that Charles Bookman proposed, something that we think would be a very interesting project to talk about, and which I think would even further improve a lot of the equity goals of improving mobility throughout the region and making it easier to get around without a car, making it so that way you don't have to drive everywhere. And you have options, whether you just want to go somewhere in the valley or pop over to Ellensburg, head over to the Tri-Cities, or if you want to go further to Seattle and Spokane.
And we had an interesting discussion yesterday in Wenatchee. Of course, Wenatchee is on the Empire Builder as it currently exists, but they said part of the problem with that is if you want to go from Wenatchee to Seattle, you can't expect that the train's going to be on time because it's coming all the way from Chicago. And so the discussion that was had was, you know, does it make sense to do smaller segments that would serve, you know, Seattle and all the intermediate stops to Seattle or vice versa that would be more reliable. And we were talking about the fact that the folks in Minnesota and Wisconsin are doing that. They're taking, it's the same route as the Empire Builder on the other end, but it would go from the Twin Cities to Chicago, but it would be a shorter train. It would be during the day, and one would assume that it would be more reliable because it would start in the Twin Cities. Now, the trick is that trains like that, by the way the legislature is written, have to be paid for by the states. Anything less than 750 miles long, the states have to pay for. So that's something that would have to, the money for it would have to come from the legislature. But as Gary said, there are grants for these. And if they build, if they create an idea that can be put forward, that there could be a grant for, it would be, yes, the state would put up some of the money, but it could be supported otherwise. And we have more support on the national level right now than we've had in many, many years. So this is an opportunity that we need to take advantage of. As you said, it's about getting the projects put together so that people can write the grants. And we really do need to do that.
This route is less than 750 miles, so it has to be state funded. That doesn't mean all the money is going to come from the state because of the huge grant money funds that are in the infrastructure bill. But it would be a service that's similar to the Cascades, which is state supported, but has also been supported by federal grants. So this route, as near as I can read the Senate's infrastructure bill, would easily qualify for federal grant money if the state takes the initiative to do a cost benefit analysis and a economic analysis, so that we have the background that's necessary to apply for federal grants. You could even get grant money just to make the application for the grant. But the state has to do the cost benefit analysis and the economic analysis.
And the other thing also is it's not just about rail. We've been talking about buses. Many other states have what they call Amtrak throughway buses that go, that connect with the trains. Okay, California has a bunch of them. North Carolina has a bunch of them. And other states have several that would be feeders. We have in the corner of the map over there, you'll see that there are some existing bus routes that already are there right now, but there could be lots more. And because we recognize that many of the smaller communities, trains serving them are sometime down the future. But if you started having buses that got people to trains, then that benefits everyone.
It creates the connected system. Yeah.
I think this is the most important. It's like, as far as getting support for this, is if you see it as part of a vision for a more livable society versus being a Big Bang Theory guy who likes trains.
No, you
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're trying to convey at All Aboard Washington. That has been a challenge in a lot of cases, is that a lot of the people who have been involved in rail advocacy throughout a lot of the past have been people who love trains, and maybe they talk about their favorite locomotives, or they talk about their favorite route from the past, but there's so much more. I mean, that was I've been very blessed to have the opportunity to live abroad, both in Naples, Italy for about 3.5 years, and then to study abroad in Japan for about a semester. And those experiences of living and studying in places that had much better walkability, that had much better public transport, all of that really influenced me when I came back to the United States, especially after being in Japan. I was able to get anywhere in the entire country without having to drive, without having to fly. It was just seamless. You know, I get my mobile Suica transit card on my phone right here, still have it with me, and I can tap to get on pretty much any train or bus across the country. You know, I borrowed a bike from a friend of mine right next to the train station, like a block away. There was a bicycle parking garage where I could park my bike for $1 a day and then walk right to the train station, get on, and I could get to Tokyo. And from Tokyo, I could get to anywhere in the whole country by Shinkansen. I didn't have to drive, didn't have to fly, didn't have to consume anywhere close to the amount of oil that I would have to anywhere. And it made it so livable. I mean, even if Japan is struggling with a lot of other challenges, despite the fact that they have a significantly aging society, people getting around is not a problem in Japan in most of the country. There are options, whether that's in the big cities or even to rural areas. Even rural trains will have, or even rural towns usually have at least a couple of trains a day or buses. And once you get there, accessibility is generally a lot better than most places in the United States. That's exactly what inspired me to get involved in rail advocacy 3 years ago when I first joined All Aboard Washington, because I saw that we're having a bunch of crises coming to a head all at once. We're having a serious demographic aging crisis. There are a lot of people who are going to get older, who are getting retiring, who are not going to be able to drive. There are a lot of people who are in places that don't have any transportation access whatsoever, even, especially us young people who, maybe can't afford to get a car or to be licensed, who don't have the time to be dealing with things when we're trying to work maybe 2 jobs in order to get by. There's the environmental crisis. All of these things come together and they all center around better transportation and better urbanity, making it easier, making better accessibility, opening up opportunities, and making sure we make the best use of our resources.
Patrick, can you throw up that slide about the cost benefit analysis and the things that it measures?
Absolutely.
The point was about the social benefits, the benefit to society. That's what we need to convince people of.
Yeah, there's that, and there's
But see, these are things that are important. The cost benefit analysis puts a dollar value on these things, like these user benefits down there. Resilience, that term resilience, for example, means what is the cost of travelers who cannot travel I-90 in the wintertime because it's closed due to snow or avalanches. You put a dollar value on that. These others are kind of self-explanatory, but these are the values that are important. It isn't just that we like trains. We have to figure out what this is worth to society by measuring these particular elements. And on the next slide there, these also have a value. They're done separately from the cost benefit analysis because of the way the federal thing is set up. The economic analysis is further evidence that the route would be beneficial by measuring these things. So all of this you could collectively say it's part of the benefit to society of this project.
And one thing that's also worth looking at as well, that is also that we think is going to be, an increasingly strong argument, is those hard costs of transportation infrastructure as it exists right now, versus the potential benefit you can get from investing in alternatives. The state that is far and away the leader in the U.S. right now in terms of rail expansion is Virginia. And that sounds kind of weird. You would think, what, Virginia, what, of all places? But what happened was a few years ago, the Virginia DOT did an analysis of attempting to relieve traffic congestion on Interstate 95 between Washington, D.C. and Fredericksburg. And what they found was that if they were to just keep doing things as they had always been doing them, if they were to just, do a study for a highway, start building a highway, take 10 years to build it, and then open one lane in each direction, they'd spend $12 billion. By the time it was finished 10 years later, it would be just as busy as it was before. But then they went one step further. Okay, we'd have to spend $12 billion to relieve DC commuting traffic. What if we spent that $12 billion instead on a statewide rail network? What they found was that they could, for that same amount of money, buy a lot of the tracks from the freight railroads, repair tremendous amounts of infrastructure, and start opening services across the entire state, east, west, north, south, urban, rural. And then they would have an alternative. And so that led the DOT to conversations with the host railroad in the state, CSX, to buy or at least negotiate certain right-of-way purchases or leases, well beyond what any other state has ever done before. And now Virginia is in the process of refurbishing rails across the entire state, expanding commuter rail services to Washington, D.C., and expanding intercity passenger rail services across the entire state to the southeast corner of the state, the southwest corner of the state, Richmond, and beyond. So even just looking at the hard numbers beyond just the benefits of society, but on what are we spending right now on our road network and what is that getting us? And when we combine that with all of the equity benefits that we know a better public transportation system and particularly a better rail network can deliver, we think that that's a very powerful argument for state DOTs to change up what they're doing.
And you will get some pushback of, not invented here. But if you look at it, the procedures that they went through in Virginia, we could do. And in some ways, Virginia is very much like our state in that you've got some very urban areas, some very rural areas, and you have the infrastructure that is overburdened. And, so they said, well, let's think out of the box here. And we've got to give them lots of credit. Plus our friends at Virginia HSR organization, which does what we do, they were some of the people who pushed this and they were successful. And now if you hear interviews with the Secretary of Transportation in Virginia, she buys it. She understands how important this is. So it is, it's really interesting if there's an article in the Washington Post that's an interview with her, and I've heard her on TV and radio as well. And we'd be happy to dig some of those up if you're interested.
Right here, yeah, Washington Post, yeah, Shannon Valentine. Right.
She's impressive, but there's no reason why our state couldn't be doing that too.
Yep. Not only was it unaffordable, the worst part was that by the time construction was completed in 10 years, the highway would be just as congested as it is today. Valentine said. So with that information, we really thought about how we could address the congestion and the mobility along the I-95 corridor, and that's how we got to rail.
Wait, go up there.
Oh yeah.
The ad.
Oh, the ad, yeah. For luxury cars for seniors. He said,
Well,
Exactly how they went.
that's
A real article.
they're listening to us. The car industry's trying to fight. They know something's going on.
Car industry's initial was moving electric cars and trains. I studied energy management, so I can tell you stories about how GM, Ford, all the other makers basically created entities just to buy up and disassemble electric trains. 30, 40, 50. So,
Yep.
they are gonna-
By the way, Gary arranged this room. Thank Gary very much. Included in this room is the water. So anybody who wants it, please.
Take a bottle with you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's hot out there. Please keep yourself hydrated. It's up with it.
Also, no, I didn't drink my usual morning cup of coffee.
That's okay. Charlie is one of 6 people in Seattle who doesn't drink coffee, so I don't judge you.
Right. Actually, that's a big plus.
Yeah. What? How is that possible? Is that possible?
Well,
Yeah.
We really appreciate your feedback. This has been
Yeah.
excellent.
Yeah, this is great information. It's actually, I always enjoy the meetings.
Thank you, Gary.
Timing is critical, so I know that Yakima is in the process of needing to update a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and are there any other thoughts or concerns kind of in the same
Thank you.
area that you guys are thinking about, that would be good to add to the conversation?
Have meetings where you guys are doing.
Oh, I said it.
Definitely will be in. Because I'm actually working directly with
Yeah.
one of our front center transportation groups, because we are doing state and federal legislation and application, so we can test the state and federal level with the disabilities. We're looking for larger input perspectives that will really begin to sway that conversation, especially at the state level. So I do state meetings, knowing that we need to do those two summary reports. Those are the things that when I talk to my local legislators, as well as some of the senators, that we can actually engage in conversations with more down. With saying things like here in Eastern Washington, we're actually struggling with